G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that it will be a blessing to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Well, thanks for coming along. Tonight, we are looking at the resurrection of Messiah. In the last session, we saw there were certain signs that accompanied his death. We had an earthquake. We had the resurrection of saints from the tombs. We had the rending of the veil. We had the faith by a bystander, a Roman centurion, who witnessed these things. And we saw that there was fear among the Jews. Now, we also learned that the bodies could not remain on the cross during the Sabbath. So they had to bring about speedy deaths for the three, which was Jesus and the two rebels. The other two rebels had their legs broken. Jesus had already given up the spirit, so he was pierced by a Roman spear to make certain of his death. And two secret disciples now come for the body to bury him. We have Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Jesus is bound in strips of linen and placed in a rich man's tomb, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 53 verse 9. Here we also saw the last stage of Messiah's humiliation. We saw the God-man, Jesus, the sinless one, dying the death of a sinner. And we also saw that none of his close disciples and friends were there for him at that time of his need. So we also saw the first stage of exaltation, because he was now buried in a brand new, unused rich man's tomb in a garden. And so we kick off tonight. In this session, we're looking now at the day of his death. It does create a little bit of confusion. And we're going to address two specific things. We're going to address the day of his death and the 3 days. So, on which day did Jesus die? Some who do not understand the Jewish reckoning of time incorrectly conclude that the crucifixion occurred on a Tuesday, a Wednesday, or a Thursday. But the Gospels clearly indicate that Jesus was killed on a Friday, and he was placed in the tomb before sundown. The term Sabbath should be interpreted normally, which means from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. And the scriptures emphasize this. And John 19 verse 31 and Mark 15:42 and Luke 23:54 and Matthew 27:62 clearly state that Jesus died around 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He was then placed in the tomb before the Sabbath began, which by Jewish reckoning was when 3 stars appeared in the sky, which is roughly, say, 6 p.m., sundown. In the Hebrew Bible also, the only time the term Sabbath is used of a day other than the 7th day of the week is of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. So it's the only other time the term Sabbath is used. Otherwise, it's used of the sabbatical year. So not only that, but the scriptures clearly state that the women visited the tomb on the day after the Sabbath, the first day of the week, which is Sunday. Now, besides the Gospels, ancient Jewish records such as the Talmud confirm that the day the Messiah died was a Friday during Passover. It says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. And a Florentine manuscript adds, and the eve of Sabbath. Now, this Talmudic quote refers to Jesus's trial and execution, and the Florentine manuscript mentions twice that he was executed on the eve of the Sabbath, which is Friday. And furthermore, twice it mentions that it was at the Passover, which is why John stated that the Sabbath was a high Sabbath. This is John 19:31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain on the cross upon the Sabbath, for the day of that Sabbath was a high day or a high Sabbath, asked of Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So it means that it was on a Friday on Passover. Finally, the Talmudic quote reveals the exact charge against Jesus, claiming that he practiced sorcery and he seduced Israel and estranged them from their God. And this reflects what occurred when Jesus was officially rejected on the grounds of being demonized, which we saw back in Matthew chapter 12. Interestingly, the rabbis of this period never ever denied that he performed real miracles. And in this particular quote, they admit that he did. Still, the main point of this quote is that Jesus died on a Friday before the Sabbath and during the week of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So teaching that his death occurred on a Tuesday, a Wednesday, or a Thursday violates the clear statements of the Gospels and also other historical documents. So that's the first thing. What was the day of his death? The second thing is, the second question has to do with what time Jesus spent in the tomb. Now, many believe that the statement 3 days and 3 nights refers to 3 full 24-hour periods. The crucifixion would have occurred earlier in the week with Jesus in the tomb for a period of 72 hours. That's what many believe. However, a bit of a problem with that. Because if Jesus was in the tomb for 3 full days and was resurrected the moment the third 24-hour day had ended, it would have been the 4th day. Not only that, when did he meet the 2 disciples on the Emmaus road? He met them on the Emmaus road on Sunday afternoon, and many hours had passed since the resurrection. And Luke 24:13-32 tells us that, along with Mark 16:12-13. Now, on the Emmaus road, not recognizing the Messiah, the disciples related to Jesus the events of the arrest, trial, and crucifixion, and early reports of a resurrection. And they were pointing out that it is now the 3rd day since these things came to pass. So the only way Sunday afternoon could still be the 3rd day is if the crucifixion occurred on Friday. Now, in defense of those who misread the Gospels, it must be acknowledged that when considering all of Jesus' statements, they appear contradictory. For example, sometimes he prophesied that the resurrection would occur on the 3rd day. And we see this in Matthew 16:21. In fact, Matthew 16:21, 17:23. We see it in Luke 9, verse 22. We see it in Acts 10, verse 40, and 1 Corinthians 15:4. Other times he said that it would happen after 3 days, meaning on the 4th day. Again, Matthew 26:61 and Mark 8:31, John 2:19-20. It all says this. Then again, he said he'd be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. And that's in Matthew 12:39-40. Now, to reconcile these varying statements, we need to look at the Jewish context of the Gospels. The Mosaic law stipulated that the new year began on the 1st of Nisan. Now, in the Jewish mode of counting years, any part of the end of the previous year or any part of the new year, whether it be a few months or even just a few days, counted as a full year. So if we look at some of the kings, if, for example, a king took the throne on the last day of a year, he was viewed as having ruled the whole year. A day later, the new year began, but the records would read the 2nd year of his reign. He's only been on the throne for 2 days, but it's now the 2nd year of his reign. The 2nd day of his reign would be considered, the 2nd day of his reign would be considered the 2nd year of his reign, because even the 1st day of a year was officially considered to be 1 year. Now, how does that translate into what we're talking about here? This way of reckoning goes to days as well. So even the last hour of a day or the first hour of a day counted as a full day. Jesus was in the tomb during the last few hours of Friday, the full 24 hours of Sunday, and then in the early hours of Sunday, the full 24 hours of Saturday, and then in the early hours of Sunday. so which in Jewish reckoning of time counts as 3 days. So if we look back at Jesus' statements, which seem contradictory, we can easily reconcile them when we understand the Jewish frame of reference. First of all, resurrection was to be on the 3rd day. And although he was in the tomb in the early hours of the 3rd day, later on that same day, Jesus was resurrected. So he was resurrected on the 3rd day. Second, the resurrection was to be after 3 days. And since Jesus was in the tomb part of Sunday, it counts for all of Sunday. Therefore, from a Jewish point of view, counting 1 full day and the 2 partial days as whole days, Jesus was not only resurrected on the 3rd day, he was also resurrected after 3 days. Third, the Jewish expression 3 days and 3 nights is also easily reconcilable, for it is a figure of speech referring to any period of time that touches 3 days and is used in the Hebrew scriptures several times. In fact, 1 Samuel 30, 12 to 13 uses it. Genesis 42, 17 to 18 uses it. We talked about the 7 days. 2 Chronicles 10, 5. So it is used throughout the scriptures. What's this all about? What we're saying here is that the Gospels were written by Jews using the Jewish frame of reference to reckon time. In keeping with their frame of reference and terminology, Jesus was buried on Friday before sundown and before the Sabbath began. He was resurrected sometime after the Sabbath on Sunday, the first day of the week. So from a Jewish perspective, the Sabbath had already ended and the first day of the week had already begun as of sundown Saturday. So 3 days, 3 nights, all of it after 3 days, all of it is reconcilable with the Jewish frame of reference of reckoning time. Okay, so now we come to the opening of the tomb, and we see this in Matthew 28, verses 2 to 4. It's Sunday, the 17th day of Nisan. It's the 9th of April, AD 30. So this is close. This is now close to the early hours of Sunday morning before sunrise. And now we see 3 things suddenly occurred. First of all, we have, behold, there was a great earthquake, which Matthew 28, 2 tells us. This was the second one. There was one at his death and now one at his resurrection. Second thing, an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and rolled away the stone, breaking the Roman seals on the tomb. And by Roman law, this action was punishable by death. But then again, who is going to try and enforce that with an angel? It says the angel's appearance was as bright as lightning. Third thing we see is because the angel's appearance was as lightning and his raiments white as snow. Verse 3, fear now fell upon the Roman guard and they became as dead men. They were petrified. They were so filled with fear they couldn't run away. They were just scared stiff, frozen. And when did this happen? It happened at or shortly before sunrise, before the women came to the tomb. Now we have the visit of the women. We see this in Matthew 28, 5 to 8, Mark 16, 2 to 8, Luke 24, 1 to 8, and John chapter 20, verse 1. Now the Gospels appear to give 4 different accounts of the women's visit to the tomb. And there are differences, but they actually complement the information found in the other 3. If we combine all 4 accounts, we have a complete picture of the events of resurrection morning. It's now early Sunday morning. Now, the different Gospels record different elements of that morning. But it seems that the visit of the women was in 2 groups. In John chapter 20, verse 1, John writes, now on the first day of the week comes Mary Magdalene early, while it was yet dark, onto the tomb. So Mary, she arrives at the tomb first while it was still dark. She saw that the stone had been rolled away and she left before she saw any of the angels. She was working on the assumption that Jesus has been taken away and does not closely investigate, and immediately she rushes back to Peter and John to tell them the body has been removed. Now, behind her were a second group of women who arrived at early dawn, according to Mark 16, verse 2. Because Mark writes, and very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun was risen. So when they arrived at the tomb, they saw two men standing by them in dazzling apparel. And Luke 24:5 tells us, these are the angels, and that the stone had been now rolled away. So to this group, the second group, the angels gave a message. The angels told this group of women, Jesus had risen as he said he would, and there was no reason to seek the living among the dead. And Luke 24 verse 5 tells us that. Secondly, they were now to report to the disciples that Jesus was risen. Matthew 25:7 tells us that. They said, go quickly and tell his disciples he is risen from the dead. The third thing, the angel says, tell them to proceed to Galilee where Jesus would meet them. Now, this was the second time that word came to the apostles that they were to move towards Galilee. They were supposed to have done this by now. The first time was during the last Passover, when Jesus told them that they were to leave Jerusalem immediately after his arrest. And you can find it in Matthew 26, verse 32, Matthew 26:32, and Mark 14:28. Mark 14:28. They didn't understand what he meant. So they were caught by surprise and they never left the city. They're still in Jerusalem. Now, two specific things happened. First of all, from the Luke account, Luke 24, verse 8, we're told that at this point, the women remembered the prophecy of Jesus about his death and resurrection on the third day. And Luke 24:7 and 8. In Mark 16, verse 8, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is with the encounter with the angels and seeing the tomb empty. They told no one outside the apostolic group. Second thing, they ran to bring his disciples word. And that's Matthew 25, verse 8. And we're told that the apostles did not believe them. Now, the report to the apostles we find in Luke 24, verse 9 to 12, and John chapter 20, verses 2 to 10. These two accounts, Luke and John, tell us what the women said to the apostles, and in particular, what Mary said to John and Peter. Mary, who was the first one there in the dark, didn't see any angels, she says they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb. Remember, she hadn't seen the angels, it was dark. She was the first one there. Mary reported to John and Peter, but in Luke verse 10, Luke 24 verse 10, and then we have, and the other women with them told these things unto the apostles. So all that Mary could say was that the stone had been rolled away and the body was not in the tomb. And we see that in the John 20 verse 2 to 10 account. But the other women reported the message of the angel that the resurrection had taken place. And so here, the 9 disciples who got the second message disbelieved the report. According to verse 11 of Luke 24, these words appeared in their sight as idle talk, and they disbelieved them. To them, it was idle talk or leros in Greek, and most concordances and dictionaries translates this word simply as that which is totally devoid of anything worthwhile. It's idle talk, it's nonsense, it's humbug. And that's what the disciples thought. However, another Greek guy called Hippocrates seems to have used it to describe a certain form of delirium. In medical contexts, the term described the talk of a sick patient delirious from pain. Now, the fact that Luke was familiar with this is another indication of his profession, because he's the one who writes this. Now, Peter and John both took off running to the tomb, and John outruns Peter and he arrives first. And now notice something else here. Simon Peter therefore also came, following him, and entered the tomb. And he, behold, the linen cloths lying, and the napkin that was on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. So when Peter caught up and looked in, they both entered the tomb and examined the burial strips. Now, the burial strips or cloths had been wrapped around his body, but there was a separate cloth that had been wrapped around his head, and that was rolled up separately. So this implies here that Jesus was resurrected right through the cloths, actually leaving them as they were formed about him. Jesus wasn't raised with a natural body like Lazarus was, but he is raised with a glorified body. They had to unwrap Lazarus while Jesus was resurrected right through the wrappings. Now, what this tells us here is that there's probably no validity to the Shroud of Turin. Whatever the image on the Shroud of Turin is, it is not Jesus. Now, when these two left the area, they both came to different conclusions. Peter, in Luke 24, verse 12, departed to his home, wondering at that which was to come to pass. He was perplexed. He didn't know what to think. And then, but John left the tomb and believed that the resurrection had taken place. And we see that in verses 8 to 9 of John 20. Now we have the first appearance to Mary Magdalene. And we find this in Mark 16, 9 to 11 and John 20, 11 to 18. Now what should be noted here is that his first appearance was to a woman, not a man. Now, if the story of the resurrection had been a fabrication, this would not have been the way to fake it, because under Jewish law, the testimonies of women were not acceptable. The 2 or 3 witnesses necessary in a court of law had to be men, never women, as a woman's testimony was not considered valid. That's why when the woman testified about the resurrection to the disciples, as we saw just in the last paragraph, even the disciples did not believe them. Now, if it had been a story which was fabricated by Jewish believers, as unbelievers often have claimed, the first appearance would have been alleged to be made to a group of men. They would have tried to make it as believable and acceptable to their audience as possible, making sure that all the witnesses were men, not women. But the gospel writers had to report it the way it really happened, with a woman as the first witness to the resurrection. And the fact that the report of the first appearance was to a woman helps to actually authenticate the resurrection story. Now, when she came back to the tomb, she saw 2 angels, but she didn't recognize them as such, since they appeared as young men. And we find it in Mark 16, verse 5 and John 20, verses 11 to 12. And when the angels asked, "Woman, why do you weep?" That's in John verse 13. She revealed her belief. "They have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him." Now, Jesus' resurrected body. When Jesus appeared to her, she did not recognize him immediately. We see that in verse 14. Jesus asked her the same question. "Woman, why do you weep? Whom are you seeking?" And that's verse 15, John 20. She assumed him to be the gardener and probably the one to have moved the body. So she asked, "Sir, if you have borne him hence, tell me where you have laid him, and I'll take him away." We see that in John 19, verse 15. John 20. Jesus then called her by name, and maybe it was something in the tone of his voice or the way he pronounced her name, which was familiar. For at that point, she finally recognized him and called to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, as verse 16, meaning my rabbi, my teacher. Now, this delay in recognition occurred at several of the post-resurrection appearances. And one reason for this is that his resurrected body had changed to such a degree that identification was not immediate. However, enough things remained the same so that eventually those who saw him recognized him. Mary identified Jesus by the way he called her name, and this may imply that the sound of his voice remained the same. Some things change, but other things remain the same. Now, the second thing we're going to look at here is the cleansing the heavenly tabernacle. Now, as Mary starts to move toward him, Jesus says to her, "Touch me not." That's verse 17 of John 20. Why? Why would Jesus stop her from touching him when later that day he allowed other women to do so? And a week later, he even commanded Thomas to put his finger on his hands and his side. Well, we have two possible answers for this. The usual explanation here is to take the Greek word translated as touch as meaning don't cling or hang on to me. In other words, Mary, don't try to keep me here on earth because I must leave. This is the Greek word used here. The other Greek word used for touch is to touch or to feel lightly, and as is used in the case of Jesus inviting Thomas to touch him later in John 20, verse 27. So that's one option, the translation of the word. Now, there's a second option as to why Jesus told Mary not to touch him, and this is directly related to the Mosaic law. He said to her, don't touch me, for I'm not yet ascended unto the Father. And that's in verse 17. Now, Jesus' statement here specifically related to the high priest's activities on the Day of Atonement, which you can find in Leviticus 16. The high priest, because remember, the Day of Atonement is the one day of the year where the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies. The high priest began the day by removing his multicolored garments, which he wore on a daily basis. And once undressed, he underwent a ritual immersion into the mikvah, and then put on the white garment symbolizing purity that he wore only once a year on the Day of Atonement. After this, the priest went through the procedure of offering the blood of the sacrifices for himself and for Israel. And once he began this ceremony, he was untouchable. And when he finished, he'd take off his white clothes, he'd undergo another ritual immersion, and then he'd put on his multicolored garments once again. If anyone touched the high priest between the first and the second immersion, it rendered him unclean, and he could not enter the Holy of Holies to sprinkle the goat's blood upon the mercy seat. He could not make the atonement with the blood. So until the ritual was completed, the high priest was untouchable. The tabernacle Moses built on earth was a copy of something already existing in heaven. While the earthly tabernacle could be cleansed by animal blood, which we see in Leviticus 17, verse 11, and Hebrews 9, verse 22, the heavenly tabernacle required cleansing by better blood, innocent human blood. In Hebrews 9, verse 23, the writer says, therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, blood of sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So Jesus, in his function as the perfect high priest, ascended into heaven at some point to sprinkle his blood in the heavenly tabernacle to cleanse it. And we find that in Hebrews 9, verses 11, 12, and 24, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12. Now, Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19 explains why this tabernacle needed to be cleansed. Because Satan, a cherub, the highest order of celestial beings, had defiled it. In Ezekiel 28, 14, it says there, the anointed cherub who covers has been cast out of the mountain of God. This is Satan. In Ezekiel 28, 18, it says that you profaned your sanctuaries. So both the holy place and the Holy of Holies were defiled in heaven. And Isaiah 14 tells us that Satan wanted to make himself like God. This was Satan's sin. And when he sinned in heaven, he defiled the heavenly sanctuary. Now, because these are heavenly sanctuaries, they require cleansing by better blood. And Jesus had to ascend into heaven to sprinkle his blood in the heavenly sanctuary. And when he encountered Mary, his comments suggest that he had not yet cleansed the heavenly tabernacle, making him untouchable. Once he performed his duty as the perfect high priest, he could return and people could touch him. So after telling her this, Jesus admonished Mary, "But go unto my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." And he's referring here to his disciples, my brethren. And the word here reflects the new relationship he now had with the apostles as a result of his death and resurrection. However, again, at this point, the disciples did not believe the first report that Jesus had been resurrected. And we see that in Mark 16, verse 11. Here we see the second appearance of the women. We find this in Matthew 28, verses 9 to 10. And behold, Jesus met them, saying, "All hail." And they came and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then said Jesus unto them, "Fear not, go tell my brethren that they depart into Galilee, and there shall they see me." So, after Mary left, the other women now arrived, and Jesus greeted them. And they came and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Now, why the difference? Why could these women touch him? This act of devotion surpassed mere touching or feeling and shows that sometime between talking to Mary and talking to these women, Jesus had ascended into heaven, sprinkled his blood, and became touchable. The fact that the second appearance was also to women and not to men strengthens the argument that the gospel accounts are genuine. Any Jewish author fabricating a story would not have written it this way, but the gospel writers reported the truth. Jesus told the women, "Go tell my brethren that they depart into Galilee," where he was going to meet them. So for the third time now, the apostles received a clear message to leave Jerusalem, but they did not believe the second report of the resurrection, so they never left town. First time was at the Passover, where Jesus told them back in Matthew 26:32. The second time by the angels at the tomb, and now the women told the disciples to go to Galilee. Now we have the report of the guard, and we see here the rejection of the second sign of Jonah. This is in Matthew 28, verses 11 to 15. Chief priests had now rejected the first sign of Jonah when they rejected the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And now we have in this paragraph here the initial rejection of the second sign of Jonah, which was the resurrection of Jesus himself. Their rejection of the truth was by this time a proven rejection of God. It was not ignorance anymore, it was a proven rejection. Some of the Roman guard reported to the chief priests about what had been taking place. They were concerned about the breaking of the Roman seal on the tomb. Why? Because it meant that they were liable to be executed. So rather than report to Pilate the story of an angel that looked like lightning rolling away the stone, which would have been pretty hard to believe, they went to the Jewish leaders. So a new conspiracy was now formulated. The chief priests and the elders called a meeting. They reconvened the Sanhedrin, and they were going to decide what should be done. And this conspiracy, therefore, was engineered by both the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And they arrived at the stolen body theory. And this has been repeated throughout the centuries. Now, notice the stupidity of their agreed statement here. We see in verse 12 that when they were assembled with the elders, the Pharisees, and had taken counsel, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, "Say that his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept." Now, if they were sleeping, how could they know who took the body? The statement itself reveals confused logic here. It's just a ridiculous statement. Therefore, it would not have stood as permissible evidence in law. The chief priests also told the guard that if the report reached the ears of Pontius Pilate, they promised to intervene so that the soldiers would not be executed. It says in verse 14, "And if this came to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and rid you of care." Now, after the Passover, the governor would return to Caesarea, possibly never to hear of their failure anyway. In verse 15, we see that the soldiers, they took the money and they did as they had agreed. So the report of the theft was spread among the Jews, and it was still the official view at the time Matthew wrote his account of it. And even to this present time, it's still the official view of the Jewish historians. Now, if the body of Jesus had been stolen, there would have been only two groups who were interested: friends and enemies. A neutral person would hardly risk his life breaking the Roman seal and facing execution. If his disciples had stolen the body, it seems impossible to believe that the same disciples later on would be willing to die a painful martyrdom for something they knew to be a lie. These same disciples later on underwent tremendous persecution for preaching the resurrection. James, for example, was beheaded. And according to church tradition, Peter was crucified upside down. Matthew was killed by the sword. Philip was hanged from a pillar. Bartholomew was flayed alive. Andrew was crucified. Thomas was run through with a lance. Matthias was first stoned and then beheaded. So of those outside the apostolic group and yet eyewitnesses, Mark was tortured to death. Jesus' half-brother James was thrown down from the pinnacle of the temple and then stoned. Jude was shot to death with arrows. They all died horrendous deaths. And in every case, prior to their execution, these disciples were given the option of giving up their preaching or facing martyrdom. Would they have been willing to suffer such cruelty for something they knew to be a lie? Makes no sense. It makes no sense that if the body was stolen, it was by his friends. No way. The only reasonable explanation for their actions in the book of Acts and beyond is that they believed that Jesus was resurrected. Now, the alternate is that his enemies had stolen the body. And we see in Acts that immediately after Pentecost, the apostles began to preach about the resurrection. The Sanhedrin tried to stop them. Now, if the enemies of Sanhedrin had had the body, they could have produced it and all the preaching would have ceased at once. The fact that they were incapable of producing the body shows that they were not guilty of stealing it either. In actual fact, it takes more faith to believe in the stolen body theory than in the written text which teaches the resurrection. Now we see the third appearance to the two disciples on the Emmaus road. And this we find in Mark 16:12-13 and Luke 24:13-32. Now, only the name of one of these travelers is given, and that is Cleopas, probably because he was the husband of one of the Marys of the Gospels. Now, these were disciples, but they're not in the group of 11. And this Cleopas may have been the same one who replaced James, the half-brother to Jesus, and the one who wrote the Epistle of James, and who was the head of the Jerusalem church. This Cleopas probably was the one who replaced James after he had been executed for his faith. Cleopas assumed the headship and he led the church out of the city in the first Jewish revolt in AD 66 across to a place called Pella on the east side or east bank of the Jordan. And if this was the same Cleopas, it makes sense that he alone was named in this account. Now, so these guys, they're on their way from Jerusalem to the town of Emmaus. And as they're walking along the way, a third man now joined them. They didn't recognize him as the resurrected Messiah. And the topic of conversation between the two disciples was about the events which had occurred involving Jesus and his crucifixion. And also the report of the women which had filtered through by then, that a resurrection had occurred and that Jesus had actually been seen by them. Now, Jesus wanted to draw them out. He wants to find out what they're thinking. So he asked them, what are you guys talking about? And we see their answer in verses 19-21 of Luke 24. They were discussing concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty indeed in word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and have crucified him. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. So they still did not grasp what the nature of the redemption was. But notice what else they said in verse 21 to 24. And besides all this, today is the third day since these things were done. And certain women also of our company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre. And when they found not his body, they came, saying that they had also seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. And certain of them which were with us went to the sepulchre, and found it even so as the women had said, but him they saw not. So it was Peter and John that ran to the sepulchre, to the tomb, and found the tomb empty as the women had said. And from Luke 24:19 to 21, it's clear that they believed four things. First of all, they believed that Jesus was a prophet of God, and it's authenticated by his words and his works. Secondly, they believe he was tried, condemned, and crucified by the religious leaders. That's verse 20. They had also believed, third thing, they'd also believed that Jesus was going to redeem Israel. They did not believe the woman's report that they had seen angels who declared that Jesus was alive. Because the apostles saw nothing, the disciples on the road to Emmaus disbelieved the reports of the resurrection from the women. Now, the expression that it was the third day since all this had happened pinpoints again that we cannot allow for 24 hours. If Jesus had been in the grave a full 72 hours, the time at which the disciples were now speaking would have been after the 3 days, the sighting by the women and the investigation by Peter and John. If Jesus had been in the grave for a full 72 hours, by this time it would be well into the 4th day. Yet they said in this passage that it was the 3rd day. Remember, we calculate how long he was in the tomb by Jewish time of reckoning. Gentiles would have done it differently. But Gentiles are not here at this point in time. It's just simply all Jews. Sunday afternoon, which is where he met the Emmaus Road disciples, was still the 3rd day, confirming that Jesus did die on a Friday. We see in verses 25 to 26 of Luke 24 that Jesus upbraided them for their unbelief. Oh, foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Then Jesus began to explain to them the messianic prophecies from the Hebrew scriptures. And he says, beginning from Moses and from all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. That's verse 27 of Luke 24. Now, this was to show them that the very things which had happened to him had been predicted to happen. And when they had arrived outside Emmaus, Jesus made as though he would go further, Luke 24:28. But they invited the strangers to go with them to their home. It was time for the evening meal, and they came into the house and got ready to break bread. And breaking bread is a Jewish idiom for have a meal, which means they prepared for an ordinary meal. And during a Jewish dinner, the host, not the guest, traditionally recites the blessing over the bread. However, a Jewish tradition says that if two eat together and one of them is an educated Bible scholar or a sofer, and the other of them is an ordinary man, the sofer gives the blessing over the food. Now, having heard Jesus' exposition of messianic prophecy, the disciples recognized him as a Bible scholar and had him give the blessing over the bread. And he would have said, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." That is that is the Jewish blessing. And at this point, they recognized Jesus in the way that he blessed and broke the bread and passed it to them. And at that moment, their eyes were opened and they suddenly recognized him. But just as suddenly, Jesus disappeared from their sight. That's in verses 31 and 32 of Luke 24. So they immediately returned to Jerusalem to report their experience of the resurrected Jesus to the apostles. Mark points out in verses 12 to 13 of Mark 16, and they went away and told it unto the rest. Neither believed they them. This third report was still not believed by the 11. The Lord was still apparently testing the faith of the apostles, who had received the witness of several women and now these men, and they still cannot believe that he is resurrected. Now we have the fourth appearance to Peter, and we see this in Luke 24, 33 to 35 and 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. Now, although we see in Mark's account in the previous paragraph that Cleopas and his companion were disbelieved by the others, while they were still reporting in Jerusalem, they would encounter further news. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5 says, and that he appeared to Peter. So of the 11 disciples, Peter was the first one to see the resurrected Jesus. It would have been for the purpose of comforting him. Remember, when Jesus predicted Peter's failure at the last Passover, he also said that the apostle would be reestablished, and this appearance was probably necessary in order to fulfill this promise. This he needed as a result of his earlier denials, and it may have been to reaffirm his prime role as the head of the apostles, a role that is recorded in the book of Acts. So once again now, he was established as their leader. We see the fifth appearance to the 10 disciples. We find this in Mark 16, verse 14, Luke 24, 36 to 43, and John 20, verses 19 to 25. Although 3 messages had reached the 11 that they should get out of Jerusalem and return to Galilee, because of their unbelief in the resurrection report, they stayed where they were. So Jesus finally has to make his appearance to them in Jerusalem. And when he appeared to them, he again upbraided them for their unbelief. 10 of the 11 were present during this encounter. When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, that's John 20, verse 19. So these disciples are still fearful of being arrested. And so they hid themselves inside a house where Jesus suddenly appeared to them and said, peace be unto you. 24:36 of Luke. The customary Jewish greeting, Shalom Aleichem. Now, when the apostles finally saw him, they still did not believe they were seeing a resurrected individual. Rather, they were filled with fear because they thought they were looking at a spirit or a ghost. Luke 24:37 tells us that. And Jesus scolded them for their unbelief. We see that in Mark 16, verse 14. And they demonstrated their unbelief in 3 ways here. First of all, they had failed to depart for Galilee, as he had commanded them this on 3 occasions now. Second, for not believing the witness of the women and the disciples from Emmaus, Cleopas and his companion. And third, when they did finally see him, they thought that they were seeing a ghost. Now, to prove to them that he was not a ghost, we read in the Luke account that he invited them to touch him. This is Luke 24, verse 38 to 40. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bones as you behold me having. A spirit does not have flesh and bones, but a resurrected body is solid matter. Jesus also showed the apostles his hands and feet so they could see that the nail prints remained. Although Jesus was resurrected, he was not yet glorified, for a glorified body would not have such imperfections. Jesus would be glorified after his ascension. So during the 40-day period from the resurrection until the ascension, the wounds from his crucifixion remained visible. When John later saw him in a vision in Revelation 1:12 to 16, he provided a detailed description of his glorified body, but he did not mention these wounds. When the apostles still had trouble believing that he was resurrected, Jesus asked them for something to eat. They handed him a piece of broiled fish, which he ate. Luke tells us this in Luke 24:41 to 43. And this again, he was demonstrating that he was not a ghost. This indicates that while resurrected bodies do not need food to live, they can actually enjoy eating. Ghosts don't eat fish. In fact, ghosts do not eat at all. They have nothing to eat with or put it into. Now, at this point, Jesus now gives them the first of the three final commissions. In the first of these, Jesus told the 10 three things. He gave them an authoritative ministry. They were now being sent by the Son, as we read in John 20, verse 21. He said, "Peace be unto you, as my Father has sent me, even so send I you." Second, the apostolic authority that had been given to Peter to bind and to loose. Remember, binding and loosing was in a judicial sense. He had the authority to forgive or not forgive in a judicial sense, not in a salvation sense, but in the area of church discipline. This authority was now extended to all the apostles. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they're not forgiven. This forgiveness of sin was a judicial sense and not in a salvation sense. Why? Because only God has that authority to forgive in a salvation sense. This concerned binding and loosing in a judicial sense, in the sense of punishing or freeing someone from punishment. And then what did he do? He breathed on them and said, "Receive you the Holy Spirit," in John 20, verse 22. At this point, they now receive the Holy Spirit, but not in the New Testament sense. They would not receive that until the events in Acts chapter 2. What this was the Old Testament ministry of the Spirit. Why? So that they might comprehend the things that they were going to learn during the 40 days of his post-resurrection ministry. The blockages in their understanding would be removed. There was a lot of relearning to be done in the next 40 days. And in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9 to 1 Corinthians 3:3, it describes the role of the Holy Spirit in the believer's mind, enlightening the mind of the believer to help them understand the spiritual things of God. That's what's happening here. On at least 4 occasions, Jesus clearly communicated to his apostles the whole program of his coming death and resurrection. And each time he added more details. Yet what happened? They simply did not understand the message. So they were actually surprised when it finally occurred. And between the resurrection and the ascension, Jesus had a lot to teach them in preparation for their mission, which is described in the book of Acts. So they needed to understand all these things. And when they received the Spirit, he began his work of illumination in them. Now, of the 11 apostles, only 10 were present here. Thomas was absent. In verses 24 to 25 of the John account, although Thomas would get 10 reports that Jesus was alive, he said, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And that is where we finish off in this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.